Some of you are probably familiar with Gleem. He is a keyboard warrior, and if you've ever gotten into a debate with him, he comes back with some very long replies. Often there are many cherry-picked links in them to support his position, and at times he seems to be blinded by his own hubris, as you will see in this video, because Gleem has invented Flerspective math. So Gleem was a guest on Ranty Flat Earth, and he covered many different topics, and I'll admit I did not watch the whole show. But as I was skimming through, I noticed this graphic. So let's take a listen as Gleem explains what it is.
I'm just going to show you a quick animation of something I've done in Excel, which was basically for conspiracy cats. And what I've done is I've basically taken the angle as 90 degrees zenith when you're at Polaris underneath it, directly underneath it. And then for every 69 miles you move away in one sole direction, then Polaris will appear to drop by 1 degree in your field of view. Now, this is not the field of view according to a globe. This is all based on a flat surface. So at the end of the day, in my eyes, yes, the globe Earth explains that phenomena of Polaris dropping when you're moving away from it, but also the flat Earth can explain that as well. And that's part of my sole reason for fighting the stance of a flat earther when globe earthers are.
Now, first of all, I really don't understand how we could say that, yes, the globe explains Polaris, but the flat Earth can explain that as well. I mean, these models are completely different from each other. And then he goes on to say that's part of my sole reason for fighting the stance of a flat earther. Well, this makes you wonder, is he really just a troll? Of course, this graphic is familiar in the flat earth community. This is from Phuket Word. And of course, he just uses the typical, this is due to perspective. But Gleem has taken this a step further. On the left over here, you can see some calculations that he has made, which is his proof that this also works on a flat earth. Of course, the only way this would be possible is if you change the actual altitude of Polaris for each latitude. So I wrote a reply, and in the second paragraph I said, no, this is not correct, because Gleem starts with a 3,958 mile altitude for Polaris at the North Pole, but then he lowers the actual altitude of Polaris for each and every latitude to make the angles work for a flat Earth. Why would the actual altitude of Polaris be different for each latitude? Does Gleem really not understand the difference between the actual altitude and the apparent height above the horizon due to perspective? Well, when I woke up in the morning, there were already about 40 replies, and Gleem was in hot debate with 5 other globers who were basically saying the exact same thing. Here's an example from Globetard number 1. I don't think Gleem is honest. Frankly, he comes over as a bullshitter pretending to understand cutting-edge theoretical physics whilst getting the basics such as perspective wrong. One thing he shares with many flat-tards, hi Riley, is his hubris. And Gleem replies, here is my full calculations, where are yours? So this is a complete list of his calculations, but you can see the formatting is a mess. So I reformatted this, and there are 4 columns. If you go up to the upper left here, we start off with latitude, and this would also be the angular height of Polaris above the horizon. Next, we have the pole distance. All of these are good numbers. And of course, we have what he calls the apparent altitude, which starts out at 3,958 miles. And then you can see with each latitude, it gets lower and lower and lower in actual height. The fourth one is the hypotenuse. Basically, this would be the distance of the line of sight from the observer to Polaris, and this is not an important figure. We can just disregard this one. Now, if we go down to the lower right-hand corner at 45 degrees north, you can see the pole distance and the apparent altitude are exactly the same at 3,107 miles, which of course gives us 45-degree apparent height above the horizon. Now if we go down to the lower right again, here we have 0 degrees or the equator, and the apparent altitude is now 0. So Polaris is literally sitting on the surface of the Earth. And you gotta wonder, why would he do this? So I asked him, regarding your flat Earth angles to Polaris, how can you not comprehend this, especially when at 50-40 you correctly say in regards to perspective of the jet contrail, and I quote, "Everyone knows that plane is traveling at the same altitude."
Now, everybody knows, and I'm sure people will all know, that that plane is traveling at the same altitude. Okay, that is just moving away from you and dropping to the horizon in your apparent perspective. Nobody accounts for this mass, for this droppage.
So again, I tell Gleem, wrong, because observed reality would not have Polaris different actual altitudes for each latitude. And he comes back, it does not, as I have clearly stated over 100 times. The column is called apparent. You are literally denying reality as you know in reality I have debunked you. And you hate it. Gleem, it doesn't matter what you call it. It is wrong. If you look up the visual angle or how big an object appears due to perspective, they all say the exact same thing. The perspective or angular size of an object is based on its actual size and its actual distance. Here we have two poles that are the exact same height at different distances, and it is quite obvious that the farther pole appears smaller because its angular size is smaller, not because the actual height is smaller. Now, if Gleem had done this correctly, he would have used this formula to calculate the apparent angle of Polaris above the horizon using the actual altitude of 3,958 miles for each latitude. Of course, Gleem replies, "I speak in the language of math. You clearly are not fluent, or you would have been able to demonstrate how my math cannot work with the math you have done. That's the only thing missing. You keep claiming the math is wrong, but cannot demonstrate it. Just all talk." So Gleem uses this formula to make the data fit the flat Earth, and he thinks everything is okay because he calls this the apparent altitude. Sorry, but this is really falsified data, because altitude is a measurement, and it should have been exactly the same for each latitude. I mean, really, this would be the equivalent of saying, well, gee, this cow is close, so it's 5 feet tall. But that faraway cow is much smaller. It's only 6 inches.
Small, far away.
So why did Gleem keep pushing this issue? Well, I think this link for the math that explains the sunset will give us an answer. And look what we have here. So up above, we have the actual path of the sun. Next, we have the apparent drop of the sun. And then here we have the apparent horizon line. And notice how the apparent sun drop and the apparent horizon line first converge to this point, and then they diverge after that point. So of course, Gleem thinks this explains the sunset on a flat Earth. And by chance, does this look familiar? Why, it is based on P-Brain's perspective matrix. And if you watch my channel, my last video upload was exposing this nonsense. I mean, seriously, does anyone really think that parallel lines diverge after the horizon? Now, this is an orthographic view or scale drawing of a flat Earth sun. In this case, I'm going to use a 3,000 mile height, and then I'll have equal distances of 3,000, 6,000, 9,000, and 12,000 miles. Now, these would be the lines of sight for an observer that was at 0 miles. And these lines of sight also correctly show the apparent drop of that sun due to perspective for that observer. Because as the sun gets farther and farther away, these lines converge downward towards the horizon. And of course, we can easily calculate these angles using this formula. But of course, there's just not enough perspective to make the flat Earth sun set. Because 12,000 miles is the equivalent of the flat Earth distance from the North Pole to the ice wall. And that sun is still 14 degrees above the horizon. So, of course, more perspective is needed, and now we have this apparent sun path that just dives right into the Earth. But the reality is, this is not how perspective works. This is really Flerspective, or just made up nonsense. This really makes no sense, because instead of a direct line of sight to the actual sun, we have the light going from the actual sun down to the apparent sun, and then it angles over to the observer. And we even have drawings where this apparent sun path goes below the horizon, which means the sun is actually going below the surface of the flat Earth. And think about it. These are grown adults that think this is a viable explanation. And Gleem has taken this even a step further with his invention of Flerspective math. So, is Gleem suffering from dyscalculia? Is he a flat Earth troll? You tell me.